In the never-ending fight against illegal drugs here in the Philippines, we always ask ourselves this question.
Hmm.
How crucial are those seemingly small, maybe even minor steps in handling evidence?
Yeah.
Could a simple procedural mistake, a slip up by law enforcement, lead to someone accused of some pretty serious drug offenses going free?
Right.
And what would that do to public safety, to the pursuit of justice? This recent Supreme Court decision, it's really stirred up quite a bit of debate, hasn't it?
It has.
It's making us really think about the balance, that delicate balance between making sure we follow the law, but also, ensuring that those involved in drug crimes are held accountable.
Absolutely.
So welcome, everyone, to this deep dive where we're going to carefully examine a very significant Supreme Court ruling that deals with the violation of RA 9165, the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002. We're going to break down the facts of this case, follow its journey through the lower courts, and understand what was the central issue before the Supreme Court. And then, of course, we'll try to understand their decision, which some might say was a little bit surprising.
Yeah, what I think you'll find interesting right off the bat is that this case, it involved a very small amount of shabu, allegedly, and some drug paraphernalia.
Right.
And the whole thing really turned not on whether the person was actually guilty, but on whether the police followed the procedures that are laid down in the law. It's a powerful illustration of how important due process is in our system to make sure that everyone gets a fair shake.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics. The case we're talking about today is the People of the Philippines v. Quirino Bumanglag y Sumalpon, and you can find it under GR No. 22884. It was decided on August 19th, 2019.
Got it.
And this wasn't just one charge. Mr. Bumanglag was actually facing two separate informations. The first one was criminal case number 1497613, and that was for possession of illegal drug paraphernalia. Specifically, they said he had a flask tube, or what they called an improvised glass tutor, and a lighter. These items were supposedly found on him back on November 9th, 2011, in Barangay #2, San Nicolas in Ilocos Norte.
And the second charge, that was criminal case number 1397713, and that was for the sale of illegal drugs.
Okay.
In this one, they alleged that he sold a tiny amount, just 0.0208 gram of shabu, also known as methamphetamine hydrochloride, for 1,000 pesos. The buyer was supposedly an undercover police officer, PO1 Chimel de la Cruz. This was supposed to have happened on the same day and in the same place as the possession charge.
And both these cases were tried together at the Regional Trial Court Branch 13 in Laoag City.
Right.
And during the trial, Mr. Bumanglag pleaded not guilty to both charges.
So let's look at what the prosecution's version of events was. Their whole case really revolved around this buy-bust operation. They claimed that it all started because they got a tip from an informant, someone they called Nicole, who told the Provincial Anti-Illegal Drugs Special Operations Task Group, the PATES OTG, that Mr. Bumanglag was selling shabu.
Got it. So a police officer, Police Senior Inspector Adriano Licudon, he organized a buy-bust team. PO1 Chimel de la Cruz was chosen to be the undercover buyer, and they had other officers backing her up. They even prepared marked 500 peso bills to use in the operation.
Yeah, this is actually a pretty standard procedure, in this type of operation. They're trying to get concrete evidence of the drug deal.
Right.
So Nicole supposedly got in touch with Mr. Bumanglag and set up a meeting at the plaza around 4 in the afternoon where they'd do the deal. P1 de la Cruz and Nicole went to the plaza as planned, and the rest of the buy-bust team took up positions nearby, ready to move in if the sale went down.
So here's how the prosecution says the sale went down. Mr. Bumanglag came to the plaza. Nicole introduced PO1 de la Cruz as the buyer. There was some back and forth about the money and the drugs, and then Mr. Bumanglag supposedly handed over a small heat-sealed plastic sachet with some white crystalline substance inside, which was presumed to be the shabu. PO1 de la Cruz then gave him the marked bills. Right after that, PO1 de la Cruz gave a prearranged signal, she scratched her head, and that's when the backup team swooped in and arrested Mr. Bumanglag.
Now, after they arrested him, they searched him, and the prosecution says they found the marked bills, a coin purse, that flask tube, a lighter, and his cell phone.
Interesting.
But here's a really important detail. The police officers who testified said that PO1 de la Cruz marked those items, but not at the plaza where they arrested him. She marked them later at the San Nicolas Municipal Police Station. This little detail ends up being really crucial to the Supreme Court's decision later.
Okay.
They also did an inventory of the items they seized, but again, that was done back at the police station, not at the plaza. According to the prosecution, Mr. Bumanglag and Barangay Chairman Reynaldo Domingo were present during the inventory, and they took pictures of everything. Then, the plastic sachet with the white substance and the flask tube were sent to the Ilocos Norte Provincial Crime Laboratory to be analyzed,
Right.
and both of them tested positive for methamphetamine hydrochloride. They have a report, chemistry report number D058-2011, to prove it.
So that's the prosecution's story. But as we often see in legal cases, the defense tells a very different story.
Exactly.
Mr. Bumanglag, he testified himself. He said that he did meet with Nicole in San Nicolas, and she was a regular passenger on his tricycle. But he says he only met her because she insisted on it. Then when they met, she scratched her head, and right after that, the police officers suddenly grabbed him. They told him to lie down, and then they handcuffed him.
Okay.
He completely denied selling any illegal drugs.
So what he says happened at the police station, that's really important to understand the differences between the two stories. He claims that a police officer took out a small, checkered bag, a bag he'd never seen before, and he says that this bag had the drugs and the marked money in it. Then they put all those items on a table at the station and took pictures of them with him in the photo. He even said that he was a pallet ulo, meaning that he was arrested in someone else's place, like he was a scapegoat.
Interesting.
Like they were going after Nicole, but arrested him instead.
Right, right. And the defense also had a witness, Anne Boudouin, who said that she saw Mr. Bumanglag being arrested and he was just walking. That goes against what the prosecution said, that a drug sale had just happened.
Right.
So you have these two completely different versions of the events, and it was up to the regional trial court to figure out what actually happened.
And they ended up siding with the prosecution. They found Mr. Bumanglag guilty of both charges, beyond a reasonable doubt. Basically, the RTC chose to believe the police officers. They figured the officers were just doing their jobs, and they decided that the chain of custody of the drugs, from the time they were seized to the lab tests, had been properly established.
Okay, so they sentenced him to prison and ordered him to pay some fines.
That's right.
But he appealed the decision, right? He took it to the Court of Appeals.
He did. He argued that the trial court made some big mistakes in their judgment. He pointed out that the buy-bust team took too long to mark the evidence, and they didn't do a proper inventory like they're supposed to. He also questioned if the prosecution's witnesses were telling the truth, especially since they never brought Nicole, the informant, to court to testify.
Right.
But in the end, the Court of Appeals decided to uphold the RTC's decision. They said the police had followed the chain of custody rules well enough, meaning there might have been some small mistakes, but the drugs themselves were still okay. The Court of Appeals also relied on the idea that police officers usually do their jobs correctly and lawfully, that presumption of regularity. So he was found guilty again.
So that's how this case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And what was the big question they had to figure out?
There were two main issues.
Okay.
First, did the prosecution actually follow the chain of custody rules for the drugs they supposedly seized, as required by Section 21 of RA 9165? And second, even if there were some procedural problems, could the saving clause in the law excuse those mistakes?
And this is where things take an interesting turn, right?
They do. The Supreme Court, they completely overturned the decisions of both the lower courts and the acquitted Quirino Bumanglag.
Wow. Okay, so what was their reasoning?
It all boiled down to the prosecution not being able to prove an unbroken chain of custody for the drugs. They found specific points where that chain was broken, which made them question whether the evidence was reliable.
Can you break that down for us? What were those specific issues the Supreme Court had problems with?
Sure. The first one was the delay in marking the drugs. Like we talked about earlier, they didn't mark the shabu and the paraphernalia right away at the plaza when they arrested Mr. Bumanglag. They did it later at the police station, and they didn't give any good reason for the delay. The Supreme Court said this was a problem because even if it was a short delay, it created a risk that the evidence could have been tampered with or even switched while they were taking it to the station unmarked.
Right.
In fact, they even referred to a previous case, People v. Ismail.
Okay.
That case also involved a delay in marking seized drugs, and the court said it was a big problem. Basically, if they don't mark it immediately, how can they be sure that what they tested in the lab was actually what they took from the accused?
Good point. What was the second problem the Supreme Court had?
The second problem was that the required witnesses weren't there when they did the inventory of the seized items. The law is very specific about this.
Okay.
It says that right after they seize illegal drugs, they have to do a physical inventory and take pictures. This has to be done with the accused person there, or their representative, and also with a representative from the media, a representative from the DOJ, and an elected local official.
So that's a lot of people.
It is. And it's all about transparency and making sure the police don't do anything shady with the evidence.
That makes sense.
But in Mr. Bumanglag's case, the prosecution's own witnesses admitted that only the barangay chairman, Reynaldo Domingo, was there when they did the inventory at the police station. Nobody from the media or the DOJ was there, and they didn't even try to explain why those people were missing.
And didn't the barangay chairman say something important in his testimony?
Yes, that's the key detail. He said that he wasn't actually there during the inventory. They called him in later to sign the paper and watch them take pictures.
Oh, okay, so he didn't see the whole process.
That's exactly.
And the Supreme Court had a problem with that.
Big time. The law doesn't say the witnesses just have to be there at the end to sign. They have to be there for the whole process, from start to finish, to make sure everything's done by the book. Because the prosecution couldn't prove that those witnesses were there during the inventory, and they didn't have a good reason for why they were missing, the Supreme Court decided this was another serious violation of the chain of custody rule.
And this brings us to that saving clause we talked about earlier.
Right.
So the law does say that there might be times when the police can't follow all the procedures perfectly for good reasons.
Yeah, like imagine a situation where the drug bust happens in a really remote area, and there's no way to get a media representative there immediately.
Okay, I see.
Those are the kinds of situations the saving clause is for. But the Supreme Court was very clear. It's not a free pass. The prosecution has to prove to the court why they couldn't follow the procedures and show that the evidence wasn't messed with, even though they didn't do everything perfectly.
They have to prove that the evidence is still trustworthy, right?
Right. And in Mr. Bumanglag's case, the prosecution didn't give any good reasons at all for why they didn't mark the drugs right away, or why the media and DOJ people weren't there for the inventory.
So the Supreme Court decided they couldn't just assume the police did everything right because of that presumption of regularity.
That's right. They said that presumption isn't a magic wand that makes all the problems disappear. It's a starting point. But if there's evidence that the police messed up, then that presumption goes out the window.
So they decided that the evidence wasn't reliable enough to convict Mr. Bumanglag.
Exactly. The Supreme Court acquitted him, not because they were sure he was innocent, but because the prosecution couldn't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. They messed up the process, and that ruined their evidence.
So what's the big lesson here?
This case is a huge reminder that the police have to be extremely careful and follow the rules when they're handling drug cases. Those procedures are there for a reason. If they don't follow them, they risk losing the case, even if they think they have a slam dunk.
This case really highlights some important legal doctrines for us, doesn't it?
It does.
One of the biggest ones is chain of custody in drug cases. That means that in cases related to RA 9165, the drugs themselves are the most important piece of evidence. The prosecution has to prove that the drugs they took from the accused are the same ones they're presenting in court. Every step of the process, from the moment they seize the drugs to the lab tests and even to when they show them in court, has to be documented and accounted for.
And that brings us to strict compliance with Section 21. The law is very clear about what the police have to do when they seize drugs, like marking them right away, doing the inventory properly, having the right people there as witnesses, and so on. This case is a big warning to law enforcement. Those rules aren't suggestions, they're orders. They have to follow them to the letter.
Right. And then there's the saving clause and its requirements. As we said, there might be good reasons why the police can't follow every single rule in certain situations, but they can't just say, oops, we couldn't do it, and expect everything to be okay. They have to give convincing reasons for why they couldn't do it and prove that, even though they deviated from the procedure, the evidence itself wasn't compromised.
Right. The court isn't going to just assume that everything is fine.
Exactly.
You have to prove it. And then, of course, there's the presumption of regularity. We usually assume that the police are doing their jobs properly, but that's not a guaranteed get-out-of-jail-free card. If there's solid proof that they messed up, then that presumption doesn't protect them. It's a rebuttable presumption, meaning it can be challenged and overturned.
So thinking about all of this, what do you think this Supreme Court ruling tells us about how important it is for law enforcement to follow the rules, especially when it comes to drug cases here in the Philippines? And how can they make sure they get that chain of custody right, even when they're working in difficult situations?
Right. We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know what parts of this deep dive really stood out to you. What made you think? What questions do you still have?
Exactly. And just to remind everyone of those key legal doctrines we talked about,
Okay.
we have chain of custody in drug cases.
Right. Making sure the evidence is pristine from the moment they seize it to when it's in court.
Then there's strict compliance with Section 21.
Following the procedures for handling drugs exactly as the law says.
We also discussed the saving clause and its requirements.
Meaning, they need a darn good reason if they don't follow the rules. And they still have to prove the evidence is solid.
And lastly, the presumption of regularity.
Yeah, which is a helpful starting point, but not a shield to hide behind if they mess things up.
If you found this deep dive interesting and helpful and you want to learn more about important legal cases and what they mean for our justice system here in the Philippines, make sure you subscribe to The Deep Dive. We're here to break down complicated legal stuff and help you understand what's really going on. Subscribe now and you'll never miss an important